Welcome, everybody, back. Nice to see Jeremy again. We missed you for the last time. Um, so I know that Olga said a little bit about Kirill and Hedia. Is that how I pronounce your name, Hedia?
Yes, that's
Okay.
right.
Um,
I,
so
it,
welcome to the
it,
webinar and to the society. And yes, Olga.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I forgot to say one thing before I leave. Um, Evan and Mohammed and I are now reading Ideas One on Mondays at 9 California time. So when you will be taking a break in this webinar, we can have those who would like to study ideas, join us. So it's
Mhm.
Mondays at 9. Just drop me an email, please. I won't be preparing lectures like Peter does, but I can guide through the book. I'm pretty familiar with ideas, and also went with Peter through ideas once in his webinar. So please just drop me an email and you're welcome in. Okay, that.
So
Okay.
I don't have your email, but can I find it on the website?
Oh, let me put it into the chat right now.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you for asking. Yeah. So sorry, Peter, I'm done.
That's okay. We're happy to have you for as long as you'd like. And you can join back if you're waiting with Martin for the appointment. So we have some newcomers. We have some people who've been here for, I think, every webinar, even before I joined. Jeremy and Sally were probably there for many years before I even joined SoPheRE. So it's nice to see a whole group of people. Just to go over the structure of today, thanks to Christos, last time we had an initial foray into sections 34 to 38. I will present on those to sort of further his own discussions. Then, Marvin, are you still okay to do 39 to 41?
Yeah.
Okay. And then after Marvin, maybe we'll have conversation after I do 34 to 38, conversation for Marvin after 39 to 41. Depending on how much time is left, I may just tell you some more things about 39 to 41. Or Miyuki, are you ready to go if possible? So Miyuki, if is it okay to go next week if we don't have time sufficiently for your presentation?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. And so then the following week will be sort of our last week on the webinar, but I want to give an opportunity to everybody who has not yet had a chance to present um, to do that. And so Hedia and Kirill, I think, are the only ones in the room who have not had a chance. If you wanted to, you could take a section or two and present at the webinar next week after Miyuki. I think what I'll do then is not prepare any remarks. We'll just talk about what whoever would like to go, what they say. And again, for the new people, that's been a departure. That would be a departure for us. Also upcoming, Olga and I have talked, we'd like the society to generate a survey on the webinar so that you can have some way of providing what you'd like to see in the future, whether changes in format, changes in book, whatever you would like to do, how well things worked, how they didn't work. Um, it seems that the webinar is growing in its reach and its popularity. And so just checking in to see how it's meeting your needs or not meeting your needs would be good. So that's all in the future. And I'm very glad that Marvin and Miyuki have volunteered. I know that everybody has benefited from doing that. I think if people, just one quick thing, if people are thinking about how to present in the webinar next week, one thing that I've come up with is assuming that other people don't know the text. Like even if we've all read it, talking as if we have not read it in other words, just stating very clearly what is happening in the sections often generates the best kind of discussion because it really does allow us to settle into what Husserl is doing. So, with that being said, any initial questions before I share my reflections on 34 to 38?
So I was wondering if you're going to present one or two chapters.
You mean right now?
No, for next
Oh,
week.
whatever you would prefer. Like
Okay.
so I think Miyuki is doing 42 to 44, so that's three. I think Marvin is also doing 39 to 41. Uh, you know, whatever you have time for. So if you wanted to do
Yeah.
just one, if you want to do two, three,
Yeah.
I think more
So
than three would be
somebody
hard.
has already taken the 44.
Yes.
Okay. So let me think about the rest because
Yeah.
I was ready for 44 because I've already worked on that, but
That's okay.
I have no idea about the rest. So let
That's
me think
okay.
about it.
You
So
can also get back to me a little later, right? Like by the
sure.
weekend or something.
Oh no, today I will tell you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Everybody ready to go? Any other questions or concerns? Just want to check the chat. That's just Olga's email and information. Very helpful. All right. So please follow along if you would like in the text. There is an online PDF. You just search Husserl Cartesian Meditations PDF. It pops up. You can look at sections 34 to 38 while I'm reading to you. And as I said last time, I think one of the most helpful questions to prepare for this week is what does it mean to begin? What is a genesis? So in section 34, we are dealing with genetic phenomenology when we deal with the way in which the ego as identical pole, P-O-L-E, issues into the personal ego. How does the I emerge? How does it generate itself? How, in generating itself, does the ego grasp its own becoming? These are the kinds of questions we can focus on in genetic phenomenology. However, Husserl says we must get clearer on phenomenological method before understanding more explicitly what the difference is between genetic and static phenomenology. The clarification that will help is that phenomenology depends on, quote, eidetic description, which, and this is on page 69, quote, signifies a transfer, Überleitung, of all empirical descriptions into a new and fundamental dimension, end quote. This transfer or guiding over is a change in register. So like musicians often talk about registers and how they move. It is a conduction, similar to the way the orchestra has a conductor. Phenomenology allows us to shift registers and to see not just particularities, but essences. And I think Marvin had a good discussion last time about essences. We can continue that. Phenomenology has, quote, led back, zurückgeführt, to our transcendental ego. We have been conducted by means of our method to, again, page 69, intentionally explicatable types of intentional objects, and thus to the essential structures of subjectivity which themselves are experienceable as an a priori. We can focus, and have focused, Husserl says, on any lived experience as such in terms of, and now I'm on page 70, quote, its sort of intentional performance, accordingly, in respect of noesis and noema, end quote. This is the essential structure of all concrete lived experiences. We were not considering whether the transcendental ego was factual when we discovered this structure, noesis noema. We were operating at the level of the essential. What Husserl is now going to do is to show how we normally arrive at any essential insight. It is through a process he names essential intuition. That is, we grasp essences directly as in a kind of seeing. We start from the concrete perception of this here, and now. The examples of a table. That's in fourth meditation. We then perform a variation, like the variations on a theme in music, except without the concrete ties to the original variation within some rule or other. No, in the case of essential intuition, our variations happen, quote, with a completely free optionalness, page 70. The only rule is that we maintain a perception of something. We now see what the epoche allows us to do. Because we bracket the question of the being of the thing in its appearing, we stay with the appearing and can change anything within that appearing that does not threaten to annihilate the appearing as such. This is page 70. Quote, keeping identical only its perceptual appearing. The epoche thus allows us to move step by step from this here now to pure possibilities of appearing that maintain some lineage back to the initial appearing, but which really explore appearing as such. At some point along the way, as we change first one aspect of the table perception, say its shape, and then another, say its color, we move closer and closer to the rule of the appearance of this table as what it is, that is, as a table. But we don't stop there. We're not looking for the essence table. So we move beyond the essence of table toward the essence of perception. And this is page 70. Quote, perception, the universal type, thus acquired, floats in the air. Not sure why it floats, but it floats in the air. We move from this table to perception as an eidos. It is because we can vary our perceiving of no matter what particular thing towards the essence of perception as such, and it is because we can intuit perception as such, that we can then understand and ground the ability to grasp the tableness of the table. That is, it's because we can go all the way from table to perception that we can stop with tableness. All essences share the intuitableness of the essence of perception. They can manifest themselves because the essence or eidos of perception as such can manifest itself. What all this means, Husserl says, is that there is not just one mode of intuition. From within the mode of intuition we call perception, the relation to this one thing here, we move to another mode of intuition, essential intuition. Essential intuition is intrinsically related to perception, as they are both intuition, that is immediate grasping, but it's different since what we grasp when we carry out essential intuition, this is a quote from page 71, is an intuitive and apodictic consciousness of something universal. The eidos, Husserl says, again on page 71, quote, is a beheld, erschautes, or beholdable universal. The eidos is not constructed, but given in its own manner out of our acts of variation. It emerges toward us. As such, as given and not constructed, the eidos, quote, is prior to all concepts. That's a big claim, page 71. How do we know that essential intuition is different, though, than perceptual intuition? We know this because we have moved. When we leave the table behind for tableness or for perception as such, we have moved so that, quote, this is 71, we find ourselves not indeed inside the de facto ego, but inside an eidos ego. The eidos ego comes to the fore as, quote, a pure possibility variant of my de facto ego, end quote. In other words, there's a rigorous interconnection of the modes of intuition and the modes of givenness of the intentional object. If we perceive the eidos, that is because we stand within the eidos of subjectivity itself. We must move in order to see differently. We must occupy a different layer of ourselves that is sensitive to the shift in modes of intuition. Husserl now says something surprising. We need not start from any particular perception of the table to get to the eidos perception and thus to the eidos ego. We could have started not with the table, but with the ego. Why is this important? It's important for two reasons. First, it allows Husserl to say that this is what he has in fact done in the first four meditations thus far. He has varied the de facto ego, Peter or Julia or Jeremy, and moved toward the transcendental and now the transcendental eidos ego. Thus, he says all previous descriptions he has been making have started within the realm of the eidetic and have been ones he has been working to translate, quote, page 71, back into that of an empirical description of types, end quote. The recognition of the parallel structure of noesis and noema stretches backward toward the perception of this table. So noesis noema as a structure is an eidetically recognized thing that then you can translate backward into how you're perceiving this table. But second, why it's important, what it allows Husserl to do is to show the absolute inseparability of intentional object and intentional act. To see the eidos of subjectivity is to see the idei that are given to it. To see the idei that are given is to see the eidos ego within which we stand in order to be with them and toward them. And this is going to be a quote on 71 again. Phenomenology is thus the, quote, uncoverings, enthüllungen, of the all-embracing eidos transcendental ego as such, end quote. The eidos ego, of course, contains all the various ways in which the transcendencies, concrete or eidetic, dwell within immanence by way of their transcendence. Only in this sense of the intuitable connection between eidos ego and eidos, only in the sense of this all-embracing structure of intentionality that reveals itself, the structure, as experienceable, can we speak of the a priori of consciousness. The a priori is lived and intuitable as experienced as a series of connections and levels that intertwine and remain focused on the appearing of whatever appears according to the differentiated manners of givenness and differentiated modes of intuition. Husserl ends this section by remarking about how the epoche and reduction allow us to focus on, quote, my pure ego. This pure ego, however, is only what gets us to the science of phenomenological description if I see in it the layer of the eidos ego, or at the very least, if not an organized layer, then, quote, the apodictic principles of eidetic experience, page 72. So for the remainder, this is like 3 paragraphs of remainder on section 34. It will be on page 72 that I'm drawing. Phenomenology is a shifting of stances, a movement. It is, and this is from page 72, quote, the transition, Übergang, from my ego to an ego as such, end quote. And this means that phenomenology takes time. The striated system of subjectivity, my concrete ego, my de facto, as Peter now, transcendental ego, my eidetic transcendental ego, the eidos ego, which is not simply Peter, right? They're unified, but also require my own movement back and forth from layer to layer. Furthermore, it's important that Husserl notes here, to achieve or stand on the eidetic transcendental ego, I do not require other people. This is going to set up the fifth, so it's important that he says this. I do not learn from them that I have the multiply layered subjectivity that I am. Rather, I, again on page 72, and this quote will be really important for what comes later. I, quote, fantasize only myself as if I were otherwise, als wäre ich anders, other. Not alien, but other. This structure will be repeated in the fifth meditation with the other person, for it will be by means of my own otherness to myself that I have any foothold at all in the perception of the other person, the alien, who looks to me as if I were there. That's what Husserl is going to say about the other person. Possibility, essential intuition, quote, again 72, precedes the science of actualities, end quote. That is, we have immanent perceptions of our own layers and the motion between them that allows or guarantees or grounds the way from table to tableness. Such a statement is pretty momentous and connects perhaps with Platonic insights. Certainly what Husserl seems to be saying is that it is because I can vary myself, because I can approach the eidetic from within my de facto ego, that I can see the eidetic there in this table as a table. Eidetic intuition is thus already within us, already enacted, and waiting for us to encounter it within the noetic, noematic correlation of those things that appear within us as transcendent. At least in terms of possibility, we are what we perceive. I perceive tableness on behalf of the perception of perception, which I have always already performed, even if implicitly. All right, so that was a lot to take in. 35 and 36 are going to be very short sections. 37 and 38 will be, there's a lot that I would like to tell you about that. So why don't I just pause briefly and see where everyone is and whether you have questions or comments just on section 34.
I was really struck by your saying it's only because I can vary myself that I can see any aiding. And whoa. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
That's a great question. And it does seem like and I said it this way, so you're not wrong, right? It does seem like I'm making a causal inference here. But really, I think what Husserl is revealing is what has always already gone on that I have not been attuned to. So prior to the phenomenological recognition that consciousness is always already interlocked with its objects, like it is just the interlocking of subject and object, we might say that experiencing the eidos or the essence is a process that we perform on the thing. But I think what Husserl is saying here is just what you've intimated, Jeremy. I have to be making moves internally within my own subjectivity in order to see the ide, which also are given to me in the mode of intuition that I now have the capacity to see. So like it's mutual preparatory work on behalf of both subject and object that allows me to do this. And I think Husserl's just charting what it is that has made it already possible for people outside of phenomenology, like I think Marvin did last week with an apple, I think, to say, well, we can get the essence of apple. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but you're muted, Jeremy.
Maybe it's along the lines of just the very nature of consciousness, of being, is that it can be grasped eidetically. And so that's not something that's exclusive to anything. And our whole life depends upon that capacity in some very fundamental way.
I think that's right. And that capacity is a capacity of motion, like of moving between, we might say moving between concerns, moving between layers. we don't necessarily see ourselves as moving, just like we don't see all of the motions of walking after we've learned to walk. The baby who's learning to walk is perhaps experiencing difficulty because they really do see all the motions of walking and they know they can't put them together yet, which is why they're pulling themselves along on tables and whatever. But yeah, we do those. And so for me at least, thinking of consciousness as this interconnected series of transitions, as Husserl says, or movements, is really good. And broadening our way of seeing objects as also moving towards us, I think, is what challenges me the most in Husserl.
And is another aspect of the eidos, maybe he doesn't mention it here, is that it's not just what you actually see, it's not just free variation, but free variation in the mode of and so on without limit, which
Yes.
is, you have to take that final step for it to be an eidos. And I guess one thing that it's interesting to think about, I'm not sure what I think, how does that relate to seeing? How does that relate to seeing? And I'm not sure what to think about that, but that's just something that I can't quite wrap my mind around. Although it makes sense, certainly.
It
That
absolutely
is essential seeing, the idea of essential seeing, and yet it involves this process that builds up and has the last step is really the introduction of the idea of infinity. So
the and so on. I'm not clear whether the and so on is the representation or the acknowledgement of infinity, but in any case, even if it's just indefiniteness, it doesn't cancel out your point. At a certain moment, I've done enough variations to see the essence. But as Husserl will say in Experience and Judgment and in Phenomenological Psychology, where he explores this description of essential seeing more directly and for a longer period of time than he does here in this section, that and so on, when I reach that point where I'm like, yeah, I could do more variations, but I don't need to, something else happens there. That is, the essential insight, the essence itself, as he says in these places, comes up through those variations and presents itself to me. So I can do all these variations, and that isn't enough to see the essence on its own terms. Like there is, I don't know, magic is the wrong word, but there is a happening there, right? It's through the different variations that this one, he calls it the one, comes up through the layers and presents itself. So all of the work that I do in variation, and it is work, and it's again a kind of movement, right? I'm moving from table is brown, table to 5 legs, table to 3 legs, table is whatever. At a certain point, up through those variations comes this thing that presents itself to me directly. Without my variations, it would not appear. But I am not the sufficient condition for its appearing either. And I think that's what the and so on, for me at least, names. It names that receptivity to this thing which has now been prepared for me, which is, that I've done the work to hear or see correctly. It's sort of like listening to jazz. Like, our 14-year-old will not listen to jazz in the car with me. She will only listen to Noah Kahn. And I'm like, you should learn how to listen to this music because you'll really like it. And she does not listen to me, right? So it's like coming to terms with what do I need to do to put myself in this situation for this thing to move me? That's what I think is happening with Husserl in terms of this perhaps static phenomenological description of essential intuition. But I really like, Jeremy, your focus on that and so on. Marvin.
Oh, I'm well, thank you both for your conversation here. The way you described the intuition surfacing of it kind of makes me think that it's maybe reminiscent of idea of grace in some theistic religions, or kind of a visitation from the Platonic realm of pure forms into the concrete of more concrete of the self.
I definitely think there are resonances with that tradition, like of grace or of uh, moving toward me or of presencing itself, something like that. Yes, I think that's true. And I do think there is an absolutely metaphysical quality that Husserl doesn't always explore of consciousness as such. That is, I think consciousness as such embraces both the subject and the object and their pre-distinct intertwining. Like we emerge as subjects out of, passive, rather androgynous beings, right? We are just infants. We are infants that, say I rather late, right? We can feel before we can see. We can see before we can talk. We can talk before we can think, right? So there's all these ways in which we show ourselves to be the kind of thing that only gets to be distinct after a good deal of work has been done passively by a kind of synthesis with our environment. And so Marvin's talking about grace. I think consciousness gifts itself with the later distinction between subject and object. And that's where Husserl is moving toward with this noesis noema interlocking. I think he's moving toward the origin or the genesis of consciousness as a pre-distinct togetherness that comes to recognize itself, much like it comes to recognize, and this, Marvin, I hope is the point, much like it comes to recognize the eidos, but it would only start the variation given the security that it's already had with the things themselves, right?
Right.
You wouldn't start to vary if you weren't already assured that you were going to see the thing that would emerge, right? Miyuki.
In this chapter, he talks about like the genesis and genetic phenomenology, and you described it as like a shift of register. But I'm kind of unsure exactly how to understand that. And is that in a sense saying that like we already have experience, we already have meaning within our experience. So we're not dealing with like um structures that are we're aware of, but also structures that are passive.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, we need to capture like experience as a whole. And in this sense, we're shifting the register to like a more fundamental level that's grasping the whole experience with all its meaning and its passive synthesis that is
Yeah.
active, like at play. Is that kind of the image?
That's, I think you said it better than I could. That's how I've been operating implicitly with it.
Mm,
Yes. And the passive synthesis comes out of this previous pre-distinct whole, right? That
mhm,
is emerging. And so the question of how do things emerge for us, both as historical people who begin in infancy, right? And um, sort of as already focusing without focusing on the
mhm,
world such that something could become foregrounded or backgrounded, right? So how is it that all of these things become? And so I think passive synthesis is exactly where he's going to go to, especially in section 38. So yes, everything you said, I loved, right? So I think
thank you.
that's what we should take as our orientation. That's very good. Kirill.
Just to follow up on, I think, both Miyuki and Marvin's points, then there seems to be then a deep presupposition of a fundamental unity between the consciousness and the world, which we're bracketing out. How does that claim of unity not involve a certain acceptance of the world's being?
So that's a great question. It looks like to me that the epoche and the reduction are made to bracket the assumption of the world's being as separate from consciousness. So the hard thing to do is to bracket the assumption that the world has its being and I have my being and I'm just over here trying to process the world, right? That's hard. Whereas something like, Heidegger being in the world, I really don't, I see Husserl embedded within Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty all the time, right? So I actually think if you look at the Crisis for the European Sciences, where he talks about the life world as basic, and I made this argument in another article, like the life world is the flesh of the transcendental ego. That is, they're completely together. And so being in the world is, I think, a Husserlian insight in this respect, that now noesis and noema is a structure that holds for the world, it holds for things within the world. And why does it hold? It holds because the proper way to address our oneness with what we see and the world, right? The proper way to address that is to bracket the assumption that they're separate and to notice the meanings that suggest, as Miyuki was pointing out, a genesis in passive synthesis that actually proves that we begin in without distinction, right?
Okay, so just to follow up on that, then it's almost as though this unity entails that there is no world out there, and there's also no world in here because they're the same world.
I think you're very close to the way he would put it. I'm not, I'd have to think through the distinctions there. But when he says, once we've bracketed the assumption that the world is separate from us, we have only one thing, and that is consciousness. And there is no outside of consciousness. Now, within consciousness, there is world, right? We have an experience of world, and we have world as a certain mode of transcendence that it claims. And the irony and the difficulty is that within the one thing that has no outside, right? That's what transcendental subjectivity is, as transcendental intersubjectivity. It's just that everything is there. Even so, everything that we encounter as transcendent points outward, as if there were an outside, while there is no outside. And so that's what allows each thing and the world to maintain its separability from me within the obvious interconnections that names consciousness as such. So consciousness as such, right, is not this. It's not even me. It is the set of interlocking active and passive syntheses that suggest a prehistory of consciousness with the world, even prior to the very distinction of world and consciousness. And I might add, for those of you who are reading Ideas One with Olga or going on to do so, this, I think, is why he can make this claim in Ideas One that it's very hard to reckon with, where he says, look, consciousness could survive the annihilation of the world. It depends, a lot depends on how you read that particular thing. But I think what he means is, if we assume that the world is somehow separate from consciousness, we can survive that, nuclear holocaust or whatever it is that would, declare the whole world to be null and void. And perhaps death is one of those things that he has in mind for reasons that are similar to what Marvin raised earlier. But in any case, the true ontology of Husserl, I think, is what is prior to the active personal consciousness that we are. And not just prior, but as Jeremy was suggesting, contemporaneous with the personal layer. Is it okay to go on, or would someone else like to say anything? Okay, so I'm gonna
One final thought. I,
go ahead. Yeah.
I think this has a lot to do with what we encountered before, the unique sense in which the world is in experience, or the world is in consciousness. And there are a lot of senses in which it is not. It's not like the world is part of consciousness. It's not like something would be in a container. And I just wanted to mention that. for me anyway, that's one way that helps me kind of make sense of this. But it's hard to understand that.
I love what you just said, Jeremy, about sort of reconfiguring what inside means or in, right? And I think you're right that the truest notion of in is something that we have within transcendental subjectivity. Only after we could explicate what it means to be immanent, which is how he turns inside into his own language, right? Once we can determine what it means to be immanent in transcendental subjectivity, we could then talk about how other notions of in or inside sort of presuppose that one, much like clock time presupposes lived time, that sort of thing. But I think you're absolutely right. All right, so what I'll do now is read 35 to 37. We can break, and then we'll talk about 38 and break, and then we'll hear from Marvin. Is that okay? All right, excellent discussion. So this is very brief on section 35. If we do not bracket the natural attitude, we might still have these insights about how essential intuition can work in a human being. We might not be able to prove the independence of the I or the psyche, and we might not have the benefit of transcendence within immanence that phenomenology does. But there could still be insights to be had on how a child develops its sense of world and family and self out of its own resources. The worry with taking this step outside of the epoche and reduction, that is, just within internal psychology, Husserl says, is that we might be committing ourselves to the, quote, relativization of consciousness, that is, the dependence on the world, which he finds to be uncritical and even threatening to the whole enterprise. All right, section 36. To speak eidetically about my transcendental ego, which remains de facto, Peter, if I have not made the transition to pure possibility, is to commit oneself to insights that are true for any ego I may ever become or be. It is to find the limits and structures of what can coexist or succeed any particular project or commitment within a life. And here again is that word, life. My transcendental ego has its life. And within the transcendental eidos ego, which I move toward when I vary this factual transcendental ego, Peter, to its pure possibilities, I find there are regularities, requirements that any ego as such is constrained to follow. This is on page 73. To be systematic about, quote, the essential components belonging to a concrete ego as such, end quote, involves finding out both the infinite breadth of possibility. I could study this or that. I could develop into a poet or a philosopher, etc. And the way in which, and this is on 74, quote, in a unitarily possible ego, not all singly possible types are compossible, end quote. I cannot be a phenomenologist and a parent at exactly the same time. If I pursue scientific discovery, I find myself unable to complete calculations when I am sad and tears are rolling down my face. To get to the, that's about non-compossible things. Right? If I'm really want to push it, if I am sick to my stomach and have to throw up, like only the toilet bowl understands me, and I can only understand the toilet bowl. Right? So compossible things are not always compossible. To get to the eidetic type of project called science or philosophy or something similar is to see my commitment to an eidetic ego, Husserl says, that is rational in a particular way. And this is on page 74. Quote, I cannot imagine the theorizing I do or can do as shifted arbitrarily within the unity of my life. The very temporality of my ego, then, provides the limitations of both particular commitments and phenomenological variation. I simply cannot imagine the fully compossible phenomenologist and parent. And this is not because I know the great phenomenologists bracketed their parenting and family in order to do their work. It is because the very egos they were in each case were different. It was not accident, but essential. I begin a child. Within that childhood, I bear the possibility to become a scientist or phenomenologist. But that is so only with further development and shifts in perspective and inquiry and capacity. I am not guaranteed to be able to enter into the possibility of rational discourse. Such a possibility is not, quote, in its own nexus, end quote, as childhood. Infinite possibilities and yet bounded. Developmental process of development and commitment. This is what it means to enter into the eidetic insights of the transcendental ego, namely that every insight, such as the noetic-noematic correlation that structures consciousness as such, holds true for, quote, every imaginable ego, every possibility variant of my ego, end quote, 75. But this means that I commit myself in all my instances, in all my shifts and coexistences, in my parenting and my phenomenology, for example, to that structure. And thus I cut myself off from certain empathic or variational intuitions, such as autism, which I understand to some extent, but cannot place myself within, or deep trauma, for similar reasons. Into those situations in which the very noetic-noematic structure appears to have issues or to fall apart, I cannot vary myself. And as such, this is where we feel ourselves bounded by this particular life of mine, which structures temporally all insights, whether concrete or eidetic. Again, much like Merleau-Ponty, this is not meant to criticize traumatic sufferers or people with autism, but it's meant to say, I have this life, and out of this life, I cannot vary myself infinitely, right? That there's only a certain way in which I can vary myself. Section 37. The regulated motion and structure of time as compossibility, Husserl suggests, is isomorphic with the motion or structure of causality. In each case, there are an if and a then. So compossibility has the same structure as causality. If I am sitting at the desk, then I can answer the phone. If I am standing by the door, then I cannot answer the phone without moving toward the desk. This is both the structure of causality and the structure of compossibility. The presence of the if-then structure, however, does not make time immediately into causality. Rather, Husserl says any notion of causality rooted in the natural scientific attitude draws its power, much like Jeremy on inside or in, draws its power from the if-then of, quote, motivation in the transcendental sphere. That's page 75. The transcendental ego has its Seinsgehalt, it's literally content of being, or, quote, consciousness constituents, in, quote, the universe of subjective processes, Erlebnisse, and experiences. That is, the very content of the being of the transcendental ego is its experiences. How are these experiences able to be unified together? By virtue of the temporality or the time that the ego lives. Motivation. If I want to answer the phone, then I must be near the desk. Is an if-then within lived experience that draws its regularity from, quote, the universal unity form of the flux in which all particulars have their respective places, sich einordnen, as processes that flow within it, end quote, 75. Experiences order themselves, that's really what sich einordnen means, within the flow, which is both their guiding principle, the flow, and nothing more than their motivational regular happening. So motivation is the guiding structure of consciousness as temporal. Causality in natural science does not have this governance. The universal unity form of the flow of lived time allows experiences to organize themselves by means of compossibility or motivation. But causality has no origin, or no discernible origin at least. And thus we have the striving after the recognition of the Big Bang and different things like that. Like if you had to start causality, you couldn't start it. But you can start motivation. It starts from the ego's life. So just remember that point. Motivation is thus the most important recognition that the temporal organization of experiences is itself given to us as something we are responsible for and live out. So even if we can't feel ourselves creating time and our life, nevertheless, we're responsible for that. Motivation, if I want to further this experience of the house, then I need to walk around it, is that which is, quote, connecting all and governing within each single process or experience in particular. That's page 75. But motivation is also, quote, even this most universal form, end quote, meaning the flow of temporality. That which establishes motivation, namely the flow, is itself a motivation. If I want to be conscious, if I want to have experiences, then I must become open to what shows itself. I must be open in that sense to time itself as my doing. How is my immanent temporality as such a motivation? It is a motivation. It involves me in my life insofar as it is, quote, a formal regularity pertaining to a universal genesis, end quote, page 75. That is to say, motivation is a source located in and as myself, in which, page 75, quote, past, present, and future become unitarily constituted over and over again in a certain noetic, noematic, formal structure of formal modes of givenness, end quote. Page 75. I really like that sentence. It's really helped me, so I'm going to continue to talk about it. The temporal unity of my consciousness is never performed once and for all. It's not like imagine having a child, which I know is ironic for me because I can't vary myself, even though I cut the cord both times for both kids. Even so, I can't quite imagine it, right? But imagine pushing out the present every time. Imagine just doing that over and over again. Imagine hooking up the present to the past and the future once. Like if you did it once, it would be like having a child. You're like, yeah, I'd like to maybe rest a bit and not do that right away tomorrow, right? No, we're doing that over and over and over again. We are giving birth, as it were, to the interlocking ecstasies of temporality repeatedly, right? That's so. It's performed at every moment anew, like a heartbeat. I must have agreed to this on some basic anonymous level. I must will both the appearance and the loss of all temporal moments and thus all content. I must do this over and over again because only in this way can, quote, formal modes of givenness, end quote, appear as locked into my life in the noetic, noematic structure. To want to answer the phone, I must commit to the present need to stretch out my hand or to walk from the door to the desk. In answering the phone, I must let the current project of my leaving the room or cleaning my desk fall to the wayside. I must commit to my experiences ordering themselves as compossible or as successive because I desire, on some general level, for the interconnection of experiences into my life. So I'm saying desire is that producing over and over and over again. I can ignore the phone, of course, and keep cleaning my desk or leaving the room, but this too is a motivation in which what I do will resurface as I repeatedly push out the ecstasis of temporality, such that I know in advance if I do not answer the call, someone may be irritated at me, I may miss a reminder, etc. My life generates itself. It gives its internal temporality to itself over and over by means of having a life, a history, an identity that maintains itself through time. This life or historicity or identity develops by means of motivations, by means of a system of if-then connections between experiences. Genesis happens according to a lawfulness that does not just allow myriad experiences that are isolated from one another to pop up like popcorn kernels in a pan or fireworks in a sky. Rather, the very fact of intertemporality pushing itself forward again and again produces the ego as developing, that is, having a trajectory or a concrete law. This is a quote from 75. Life goes on as a motivated course of particular constitutive performances, which, according to universal laws of Genesis, produce a unity of universal genesis of the ego. That's an end quote. There are experiences only insofar as they are meanings that I can take up or ignore or follow, from this piece of popcorn toward a satisfying snack, or this firework toward an enjoyable or irritating evening of patriotic ritual. Genesis of meaning is thus on the way, always already. Experiences are already interconnecting in motivated systems in order to bring to the fore and to regenerate the genesis of the being of the ego. Like, we keep coming again and again. If our intertemporality is what we produce, we also produce ourselves over and over again. As the intertemporality that temporalizes itself as the being of the ego, Seinsgehalt, the experiential unity of experiences within motivations and within systems of motivations occurs as a history. Quote, the ego constitutes himself or herself for herself in, so to speak, the unity of a history. End quote. Page 75. Intertemporality thus both presupposes and produces itself. Experience presupposes the ego and works to bring it to the fore. This is the way we experience it, witness self-identity and the identity of others. The baby presupposes an ego in order to be self-identical as she learns to walk and talk. And yet there is a reason that the baby does not speak of himself in the first person or use the pronoun I until later. This is because Genesis is a process and not a singular moment. It is the very unfolding of intertemporality turning back on itself. We do not only need to constitute or recognize the noematic objects of experience, we need to recognize or activate the constitutive systems by which we noetically comport towards these noemata. Both the noemata and the noetic system of acts appear within lived temporality as moving towards us. Both noema and noesis, both objects and acts, quote, are themselves possible only within the frame of a genesis of conformity with laws. End quote. That's 76. There are not first objects and then acts. I guess, Kirill, that's what I was trying to suggest that he's going to. There are not first acts and then objects. Both emerge within the genesis of the ego. Both are already directed by lawfulness of the self-becoming of the ego. The act and the object are compossible. They are given together. And this is because they are given within the framework of the ego, which embraces both immanence and transcendence within itself. The ego is alive to them, within them, across them. And as it lives its way into, within, and across them, the ego develops its historical character as, quote, habituality. 76. Perhaps I am scared as a child of popcorn, which popped out of the pan and singed my skin, or of fireworks, which startled me. My relationship with these objects does not then simply pass away. It forms a likelihood that the next experience of similar popcorn or fireworks will be constituted or recognized by me as threatening, as to be avoided, etc. Experience thus predelineates itself within the very genesis of itself. And in its self-predelineation, experience ensures that my ego develops in a certain way, namely in that of, quote, a firmly developed habituality acquired by a certain genesis in accordance with eidetic laws, end quote, page 76. If I am to overcome the predelineated constitution of popcorn or fireworks as dangerous or irritating, then I need to have further experiences of them that challenge that narrative that has already been developing in me as the motivated acceptance of the way they are. It is possible, of course, to shift motivational systems. They develop and predelineate the future based on the past. Another experience in another register gets added to the past and allows for motivational systems to anticipate more richly or broadly what they might yet be to me. But I cannot simply at will change the way I have developed my habits. Time must do its work. It must come to be for me. It must genetically work its way in. But what about ideas of generic or abstract things? Husserl asks after the idea of space or of time. These are questions, he says, for the transcendental level. It is clear now why he has emphasized the move from the variations of the table being perceived towards perception as such, following the laws of the phenomenological epoche reduction. It is from the experience of lived space that space as such arises, or rather, we live space concretely and transcendentally and can pass from one to the other because what is being produced or constituted in experience is not simply the concreteness of the ego, but also its lawfulness as such. What gets to come to the fore, what is genetically constituted, is the concrete space as lived, as a way of living space as such. So again, we get to the idea of space by living it, because the idea of space also has to enter into our life as meaningful. So we live the meaning of concrete space in order to live into the meaning of space as such. There is a problem with taking phenomenology as simply static, as if we are always already formed as both concrete and transcendental in their unity and in their separability. We need to look toward, and this is page 76, quote, ultimate genesis. But this ultimate genesis, it seems to me, cannot ever get to a point where we have only an ego or only a world. The ultimate genesis of intentionality is intentionality itself. It is the happening of intentionality as always already presupposing and developing itself simultaneously. The question for the phenomenologist then is whether or not the ego can vary itself so much, this is page 77, that, quote, he does not keep even the ideal restrictive presupposition that a world having the ontological structure accepted by us as obvious is essentially constituted for him, end quote. Such a variation away from the ideal restriction is only possible if we broaden what it means to generate or to bring forth something for the first time. Does the infant, for example, have a world? Does the having of a world develop in tandem with and in parallel to the development of the ego? Are there passively genetic syntheses that allow for the ego and the world and the intentional relationship between them to be both presupposed and developing? Okay, so that gets us through 37. Marvin, I promise 38, and then it's you, right? So 38 is like smaller font, but I think it's only 3 pages. But why don't we stop and see if there's any comments or disagreements or questions on 35, 36, and 37.
Well, I was most struck by your making the point about motivation. And I think it is that we can think of motivation as one thing leading to another. But there's a deeper sense of motivation, which is the presence of temporality as such. And so to be a conscious being, or especially to be a fully responsible conscious being, we need to consent. We're in a sense, we're always consenting to that, but that's also something that is a responsibility. That was the most interesting point that came across to me, and that kind of relates, I think, to what you were saying before about I forgot what it was, but a similar parallelism between yeah. So I just wanted to mention that to see if I got that right.
I love your use of the word consent. Yes, we are consenting to temporality. That's, in a way, replacing creating it within ourselves, right? I mean, we're giving birth to it over and over and over again. That's what it means to have a life. But we're never able to witness ourselves creating the internal stream of time consciousness. But we are consenting to it. And as you said beautifully, that's what gives us the responsibility. So I agree wholeheartedly with that.
And I guess that also in terms of terminology, and Husserl does say, I think, we produce time. So really, I mean, but that kind of, maybe there's a sense in which that's true, but it also seems obviously how can we produce a passive synthesis? And it is a passive synthesis. And yet it feels to me that in some sense, like we are consenting to it. We're going along with it. We can't help but go along with it. And yet we go along with it willingly and understandingly. So the talk of producing is not entirely off base, but it's kind of ambiguous, I guess.
Sally.
Yeah, I just wanted to say what I find striking. Please set me straight if I'm on the wrong path here. But a few weeks ago, I said something to the effect of, we look at Heidegger, but especially Gadamer, that they were sort of the authors of hermeneutics. But indeed, we see this originating with Husserl. Here I see Michel Henry's immanent affectivity. Here, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm seeing this with Husserl. He's saying it just springs forth from us in an almost autopilot way. And yes, on the one hand, we can be aware of it, but on the other hand, it's just like it emerges out of us. This is part of being. And I mean, I don't want to insult Michel Henry, but I'm thinking, I think this originates in Husserl as well.
Yes, I agree.
I
Good-
might
good
be so bold as to say that it originates even earlier whenever metaphysics or like medievals or ancients considered concepts of the possibility of self-movement. In a sense, it's like appropriating time as my movement through it as sort of an active and changing agent, mentally as well as physically.
Marvin and then Hidya.
I was very struck by that last paragraph where you ended 37 about this idea of the maximally universal eidetic phenomenology. And this idea of maximally universal feels like Husserl is engaging in the variation exercise and saying, oh, there's a limit here, but the limit is towards the most extreme abstract. And would the maximally universal eidetic experience be the same as what's referred to previously as like the pure ego? So it's actually so pure that I find that the terminology is misleading in the sense that ego and non-ego would my sense of a maximally universal eidetic experience would be pre-ego, before the construction of ego and non-ego. It'd be non-dual.
So I think you can do both the non-dual and the dual within the sense. So the maximally eidetic, maximally universal would be to see those things as nesting within one another, right? So I think, and other people can disagree with me, but I think that what he wants to say here is that even in the pure ego, right? And oftentimes, at least for me, when I think of pure, I think of really good water. It's so pure. There's nothing in it. You can see right through it, right? It's almost like it has no
Right.
content. It's just water, right? But I don't think that's true for the ego, where it's not fully transparent. It's not as if nothing is there. What's there, and I think this makes Husserl very different from Kant, for example, with respect to transcendental subjectivity. For Husserl, the pure ego has a life. It has its internal temporality, which is self-constituting, which is what he says in the lectures on time consciousness, right? It's this passive, pre-reflective, self-constituting flow that you can witness, but it is you, but you see it almost as if it were different. And so this whole discussion that he's doing shows us that everything you just said is true, but the reason that it's true is because it has a limit, and the limit is life. It has to be lived. All of the pure transcendental subject must be lived. And so insofar as it's lived, it is not just a system of musts or shoulds. It's not a system of rules, as if you could write them down and deduce them without showing how you deduced them, like the categories or whatever. It is a happening that unfolds according to, as Jeremy said earlier, motivation, right? According to temporality as both presupposing us and as our product. So anyway, that's great. Hedy, go ahead.
So, this is a follow-up question regarding, I was very concerned about, how much is the contribution of ego as opposed to contribution of consciousness in time constitution. Because usually when we're speaking about time constitution, it seems that consciousness does everything. And as Sartre claims, transcendental ego is superfluous and something like that. And many contemporary Husserlian scholars, I think, believe the same thing as well. But I was wondering, as Sally said, we can find kind of the ideas of affectivity and the passive synthesis in Husserl, and specifically in his Freiburg period. So, if so, does it transform our conception of time constitution, and shall we incorporate ego in its total concreteness in the constitution of time or not?
That's a great question, and I will try to answer, but I'm not sure that I can do it justice. And I think this is kind of directly
Thank you.
related to the theme you're working on, if I remember what David had said to me. Is that right? So this is what you are writing about. Yeah. Okay. So you should check me against what you know, right? So maybe we should just say what you think, and maybe you can after this. But I think just like Marvin's discussion and question, I think it could only be that temporality must be pre-egoic and egoic at the same time. For us, there are layers on which we can isolate. So when we get to time consciousness as itself a kind of abstract self-constitution that we cannot actually see, flowing out of us. Like that's us recognizing from a concrete standpoint, as it were, like what that layer of abstract passive synthesis is like. But it also issues immediately into a concrete ego, who is the one, by the way, who has to go through the epoche to recognize what it is that's happening. And so they are immediately transferring layer to layer, right? We couldn't have pure consciousness without being a personal consciousness. And he explores that, Husserl does, in Ideas 2, right? So what does it mean to be a personal consciousness? What does it mean to be a pure consciousness? These are relevant discussions, but I think it's not like it's not like we have to wait. Oh my God, is my abstract self constitution catching up with me? Can I live more of my life now? Like and you weren't asking that, I know, but think about just the way in which coming down on one side or the other harms us. Like we are this mysterious being that is both transcendental and concrete or personal. And at any moment, any particular experience of this here now can reveal the transcendental structures that we are living on some other layer of ourselves, right? And we can translate backwards from the transcendental insights that we only get if we can make it onto that layer. And we can say, oh yeah, that means that the table has always been a noema to my noetic action. But we didn't see that before at all. Like it was closed to us until we found the right approach to get there. So I can't, I mean, I'm not the most brilliant of scholars, but I can't see how you could isolate them and say time consciousness is simply pre-reflective. And therefore, as Sartre says, the transcendental ego is bogus.
Thank you so much. It
I
was
don't know.
really,
Do you
helpful.
agree, or do you want to say anything more?
Yeah, I do agree. And my project is like incorporating concrete ego in like implicit, I don't call it pre-reflective self-awareness, I call it implicit self-awareness to distinct myself from, these scholars like Zahavi
Yeah, Zahavi
and
does that.
Jumot. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anybody else? Excellent. And hopefully, I mean, all of you are really wonderful. And hopefully, Hedya and Kirill, you see us as being a community of supportive people. Like that's really what we should be for each other. So I'm hoping you feel that way. So.
Yeah, I feel that, and I'm already inspired by, the ideas and questions and presentations. Thank you so much for having me in this, group. I regret I couldn't attend it earlier.
Yeah. I was kind of struck over the course of the conversations. I remembered something I was reading in I was for a time involved in a communion and liberation group at the university I went to for my master's. I was reading Giussani, and he was talking about this moment of childbirth when he was with the mother, and the mother saw a baby who had just been born and saw the baby crying and kicking and screaming. It's like moving on her own. And it was like, and I think it was kind of interesting to hear then this question of like, is it implicit? Is it pre-reflective? Is it egoic? Is it non? Actually, in a way, it's just sudden. It's all together then that the baby wants to move, wants to change, wants to experience things, already in the sense of like other possibilities, other things going on. It's that was the kind of thing that struck out to me when we were talking just last few minutes. Wanted to share that, I guess.
That's excellent. And it goes back to Sally's point about hermeneutics being, what Husserl is doing. Like we are exploring the happening of happening. That's what phenomenology is doing. What is the meaningfulness of the event as such? And the only way we could ask that question is if we are the event as such that recognizes itself as the happening that it is. And the only way we could do that is if there is no other outside. Like if we were seriously answering to things that were radically separate from us, we would never begin to unpack hermeneutics. Those things matter to us and thus must be within a transcendental subjectivity such that in some sense we are them. Like we are the happening of the meaningfulness of the world insofar as it's already related to and embedded within our acts. And so I think that's what phenomenology does to show itself as continuously hermeneutic. And Kirill's point about the baby moving on her own immediately is that like you're living into the development of both the transcendental and the empirical simultaneously, right? Like, I wonder, and this is something I don't know, but I wonder if for Husserl, if phenomenology is infinite task, which he says often, if that means that I come to understand the transcendental subject as itself developing over time. That is, if we form really importantly democratic communities that haven't been seen before on the earth, let's say, right? If we then begin to intuit different transcendental structures by means of the things we put into practice, can we bring about um, transcendental structures by means of our concrete life? I'm not sure, but at any rate, that would be, if we were able to do that, that would be a severe blow to thinking of the transcendental as preordained sets of rules. Anyway, so I have about 3 pages on 38, and then I want to let Marvin, how much time do you need, Marvin? Because I can just drop this if you would need more than 15 or 20 minutes.
Yeah, I think I could fit in 15 or 20 minutes. I've also compiled a number of comments and questions relating to it, so I'll try to maybe reduce them in the interest of time.
Well, I'll try to reduce mine in interest of your time. So if you don't need to trim, don't trim. All right. Or if you feel like you'd like more time, then we'll start with you next time.
Okay.
Can you come next time? Is that
Yeah.
okay? That would be next week for everybody who's thinking. So section 38, I think, is the most important one that we've read to this point in the fourth meditation. And it's about Genesis, active and passive. And it's something that Miyuki was talking about earlier with passive synthesis. Genesis for Husserl happens according to principles or rules. Active Genesis happens according to our egoic acts, in which the ego, quote, this is page 77, functions as productively constitutive, erzeugenden constituierendes. Actually, the German is clearer. The acts of the ego, or I, are erzeugendes, or generative. The I itself is constituting by means of the acts. Active genesis is something we actively do. It includes logic, combination, collection, counting, predicating. It's not just my own acts. Rather, active genesis is how we would characterize, quote, page 77, ego acts pooled in a sociality, durch Vergemeinschaftung verbunden. The combination, verbinden, of the acts mirrors the combination, verbinden, of the egos within the community. We collect because we are collected. We predicate because we are predicated. But what do we generate actively? We bring to the fore new objects. We see the forest by means of the trees. But we do this, quote, on the basis of objects already given in modes of consciousness that give beforehand. Page 77. In the German, Husserl states that our active constitution, or bringing to light new objects, happens, quote, out of the foundation of pre-given objects, which occur as meaningful because of manners of pre-giving consciousness. And in German, auf dem Untergrunde schon vergegebener Gegenstände in vorgebenden Bewusstseinsweisen. That's to say, Husserl emphasizes here that active genesis always already interacts with passive genesis, with the pre-givenness, vorgegebenen, of the world to which we are already passively and non-self-consciously responding. We do not simply create or count or collect out of nothing. There is no pure action devoid of the always already intertwining of world and ego. Even the new objects that are able to appear only by means of our active genesis, quote, present themselves for consciousness as products. So Dorian Cairns, the translator, is not wrong to emphasize the reflexive character that objects present themselves, but the German is simply auftreten, so there's no Sich there. We do not control the appearance of the product as product. We simply notice the active way in which we have played a part in their possibility of appearing. Just as the manner in which the objects are combined is isomorphic with the way the egos are combined in sociality, there is another intertwining that is important here. Husserl says we do not only act on the pre-given object to produce a new object, we also act upon ourselves. We bring to the fore a, quote, consequent habituality of continuing acceptance, which thereupon is a part of, mitgehört, belongs with, the constitution of the object. The active genesis, in other words, must be what brings about not just a new thing to witness, but a new power of witnessing. Intentionality only brings a connected structure to bear. I change myself when I change the way in which the object appears in a collection. To witness you in a friendship with me is different from witnessing you in a webinar, in a collection of phenomenologists, etc. It is not only you who are different, I am as well. We live into active genesis, seizing upon something, attending to something. Surely these are with us from the beginning. Husserl does not fully commit to answering this question about the, quote, lowest levels of active genesis. What he is willing to say is that, quote, page 78, anything built by activity necessarily presupposes, at the lowest level, a passivity that gives something beforehand. The pre-giving passivity is both something we do and something we don't do. It's a giving, but it's a pre-giving. We are involved, yet not involved, in such a way that we can find our identity as an actor within it. The pre-given thing that the child turns to notice for the first time, a ray of sunlight through the curtain by the window, a plush feeling of the carpet with its tufts, is already given, quote, with the originality of the it itself in the synthesis of a passive experience, end quote, page 78. Passive genesis, therefore, happens as something that the thing does. It is given as it itself, and as something I do, synthesis. Or rather, the entirety of passive synthesis happens before the distinction of object and subject has done its work. The it itself and the grasping of the object within experience is done at the same time, or without a marker of successive or compossible. That would be very interesting, right? If there is something happening that produces internal temporality without markers of intemporality. We are preparing ourselves for the active grasping of the thing is preparing us for the active grasping of it, and then we come to it. We see the sunlight on the floor, we feel the carpet, and explore it with our fingers. Passive synthesis is not merely preparatory, however. Within active synthesis, quote, page 78, the passive synthesis that supplies all their material still goes on. Pre-givenness and the indistinction between subject and object renews itself continuously in order for active synthesis, active genesis to notice new meanings, sides, etc. But the passive synthesis is not something different in kind from active. The way that things begin to show their new sides is still temporal in its very structure, still able to be said to be mine. How do I know this? Because even passive synthesis, quote, has its history, evinced in the synthesis itself. Page 79. The synthesis of passive generation, Husserl says, is selbstbekundende, or self-manifesting. Cairns translates this as evinced within, but he's just wrong. But the historical quality of the passive synthesis is not a quality of it. It is an act of self-presentation that is inseparable from the manifestation of the thing. The passive synthesis that I cannot catch myself doing is nevertheless part of my life. It is a life that is pre-personal or extra-personal, and yet it happens within my life as the very self-manifestation of both my act or my possibility of acting and the object or the possibility of appearing. When we turn to ourselves as perceptual human beings, we find, Husserl says, that we had to learn, quote, to see physical things. We had to learn to see physical things. Even though we cannot put ourselves back into infancy or put ourselves back into the state of being indistinguishable from the world or the object, we can find, page 79, quote, intentional references, Verweisungen, leading back to a history. The way that things appear to me in my own self-aware active synthesis, the forest appearing out of the trees, points back to a basic involvement with the world, with sight fields, with colors and shapes, with counting and collecting, with attending and focusing my eyes, with foreground and background. All of these moments of passive synthesis are not able to be witnessed by me in their occurring, but they remain as references, Verweisungen, within my active taking up of the forest. And Husserl adds, these passively recognized pre-forms or pre-objects are what we encounter in their lawfulness. That is, there are only so many ways in which passive synthesis operates or leaves its traces within the active synthesis. And in their serving as, quote, products that persist in a habituality relating specifically to them, end quote, page 79. I have a habit of taking things together, or as Husserl says in the fifth meditation, of pairing. This habit allows the active taking up of the forest. In seeing the forest, the passive synthesis of collection or of seeing together becomes actually operative, and I feel a movement within myself toward the forest and no longer just toward the trees. I am motivated to see the whole by means of the parts, unbeknownst to myself, which I have already brought together. Logic, then, is not an operation of mind alone. The basic forms of perception, the activities that we engage in as infants, building toward explicit self-recognition and explicit object recognition, these are all experiences of pre-givenness. Quote, everything known to us points to an original becoming acquainted. Page 80. Logic is what we already have experienced within our passive non-differentiation from things. All right, I'm going to turn it over now to Marvin. Do you have enough time, Marvin, do you think?
Yes, that should be fine. Maybe a little stretch. For a little breath here, remembering that I have a body and it likes to move a little bit. It's been wonderful, but I noticed that I've been sitting very still here. Okay, so the title of 39 is Association as a Principle of Passive Genesis. Just a word of background here. I'm a beginner really to Husserl, so I ask indulgence for people who are more familiar with this, but it was helpful to me to just review that as background. There's originally talk of the two types of synthesis, active and passive processes, which present in the givenness of the moment. However, I'm highlighting here, synthesis is not the same as genesis, which is referred to in Peter's earlier presentation, really goes into much detail about this. But in short, temporality is the distinguishing factor, it appears, between synthesis and genesis. In section 37, there's a quote, time as the universal form of all ego-logical genesis, and also life goes on as a motivated course of particular constitutive performances with a multiplicity of particular motivations, which, according to universal laws of Genesis, produce a unity of universal Genesis in the ego. So this highlights the temporality of Genesis. So keeping in mind then that Genesis is this evolution over time and not a present moment givenness, then we'll continue here. The passive Genesis is defined as an association. So, and association in turn is a type of intentionality having a subject and object. So this association, since it's a genesis, is evolving over time. It's not a particular association. So, for example, of the popcorn burning a person, and then they could be said that they associate popcorn, or at least the popping of popcorn, with unpleasantness and pain, that this is open to modification and change over time. There's a quote here: association is a title, moreover, an extremely comprehensive one, for a conformity to eidetic laws on the part of the constitution of the pure ego. So the pure ego, as we were discussing, even has this form of the maximally universal one. So even there, apparently, there's these eidetic laws happening. There's a quote in here in this section of ego is seen as a nexus connected in the unity of an all-embracing genesis, an infinite nexus of synthetically congruous performances at levels, all of which fit the universal persisting form of temporality. So this is very, very much in ego seen in a time dimension, a nexus, a coming together, a unity of all of the experiences, all of the passive and active synthesis of the past and present coming together. And this process of I don't want to call it binding, but it's something like that. There is some kind of an outcome, or at least a conscious outcome of the binding of this potentially enormous amount of experience. This binding together, or is called the ego, or at least ego as a nexus. And then there's a discussion about facts with its irrationality is itself a structural concept within the systems of the concrete a priori. So what are common, I take this idea of fact as more of a kind of a relative fact, as discussed by natural sciences, or even by naturalistic psychologists. The irrationality I'm interpreting in this quote is perhaps more better said, pre-rational, in that it's but I'm a little unclear about the interpretation of that. So there's a lot here, so I guess I'd like to just open up for comments or clarifications or further questions on this section, then I'll proceed to 40. Okay. Okay, so 40 is the transition to the question of transcendental idealism. And a key quote is the static and genetic constitution of objectivities of possible consciousness, phenomenology, seems to be rightly characterized also as a transcendental theory of knowledge. So this is, in my mind, quite a claim, and this whole section 40 feels like it's setting up or motivating 41. And I'm getting people excited here. We're going to do epistemology confrontation or discussion at least. And he contrasts this view of theory of knowledge, epistemology, with a traditional theory of knowledge, which assumes a Cartesian-like ego. And every grounding, every showing of truth in being goes on wholly within myself, and its result is a characteristic of the cogitium of my cogito. So I think this is a very accurate statement that the naturalistic sciences and even naturalistic psychology would have that presupposition. And then Husserl states that the problem is how can we, the problem with this conventional ego or naturalistic ego based science or philosophy, Husserl says its problem is how can evidence claim to be more than a characteristic of consciousness within me? And for Descartes, the answer, in order for Descartes to answer, he resorted to making references to divine truth. But this is all set up for the radicalness of phenomenological epistemology. So I'd like to continue here to 41, and we'll see exactly what he has in mind here. So 41 is titled Genuine Phenomenological Explication of One's Own Ego Cogito as Transcendental Idealism. So this problem, the Cartesian or the relative ego, the apparent ego or natural ego, forming a basis of a theory of knowledge, Husserl feels that this isn't a real problem, that there's a very fundamental inconsistency here. He says, when I apperceive myself as a natural man, I have already apperceived the spatial world and construed myself as in space, where I already have an outside me, and the outside me is that's I'm taking as an expression or the formation of the natural ego. I'm kind of wondering if Husserl is referring here to the term outside me as what he refers to as this pure ego forming a concept of itself as being in the world. That's what it means, outside me. Therefore, the validity of world apperception has already been presupposed. In contrast to in his phenomenological system, in contrast, one sets to work attempting in a systematic self-investigation and as the pure ego to uncover this ego's whole field of consciousness. One recognizes that all that exists for the pure ego becomes constituted in him himself. Furthermore, that every kind of being, including every kind characterized as in any sense transcendent, has its own particular constitution. So the constitution being, I'm not sure if this is technically accurate, but constitution is the ways of genesis or coming together over time. So this again feels very accurate. Babies don't talk about transcendent or immanent or any of these things. These terms occur to us, I think, because we're operating under the perhaps unwarranted assumption that we are the natural ego. And then from that basis, we have all these questions. So continuing here with Husserl, the theory of knowledge is accordingly possible only as a transcendental phenomenological theory and has to do exclusively with systematic clarification of knowledge performance, a clarification in which this must become thoroughly understandable as an intentional performance. So keeping in mind the technical use of the word intention, meaning subject and object, rather than intentional in the sense of I'm planning it and in that other sense. So basically, the theory of knowledge is possible only in a phenomenological sense, and because that's the ultimately kind of the only sense which is at root of all experience. And because of that, the best we can do is a clarification of knowledge performance, which I find a very wonderful way of putting it, because performance to me suggests action in the world, and hence knowledge is not something pre-given or at the level of a universal, or at least common types of knowledge, that it's produced through understanding the structures of subject-object performance by oneself and others. So I don't know. To me, this is good news, and seems like a good answer to the dilemma of resorting to God or other techniques. Then he goes on to say the genesis of other things, in quote, outside of the naturalistic ego, end quote, and other egos and philosophy itself, that by means of the alien constitutings constituted in my own self, there becomes constituted for me as has already been mentioned, the common world of all of us. So, in other words, the natural world is an outcome of the constitutional structuring process in the nexus of ego in the phenomenological sense. The phenomenological world is the genesis, is the genesis of the naturalistic world and also of naturalistic knowledge. And let's see. Here belongs also, of course, the constituting of philosophy as common to all of us who meditate together ideally in a single philosophic perennis. Yeah, so all of our ideas of philosophy and commonality or arguments for that matter are all springing forth from the structuring, the unfolding and the genesis of our phenomenological basis ever evolving in Genesis. And he ends this section with a kind of almost a rallying cry of and motivating the next section, that the existent is a practical idea, that of the infinity of theoretically determining work. So, yeah, he's not referring to the existent, or I'm taking existent to mean being, that being is some kind of abstract entity or a thing in itself, like Kant or something, that it's the result of admittedly an infinite amount of theoretical determining work. So as I was going through this, when I joined the class, somebody in the class said one of his motivations or inspirations to join the class is he wanted to find out what the phenomenological answer to how do atoms exist. How would that work? I think, well, he's not here, unfortunately, but this section to me makes clear that if you want to know about atoms, it's the same as knowing about anything else. You construct or you analyze what the construction forces are of the knowledge production. And probably for most people, this will be intersubjective with getting reports from other people, presumably in the case of atoms, other reports from other people about the experiments they did and how they set the machines up and what the machines did and so on. But it's a highly contingent sense of what existence or being is. So I have some other comments, but I want to leave time for other people to make comments or questions.
Any thoughts for Marvin? Or if you have thoughts that you're not quite sure how they fit into what he said, anything on 39 to 41? Hedia, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Marvin. That was really helpful to understand these sections. But I have also a question regarding irrationality. I didn't follow what it is exactly. And regarding association, is it intentionality? Does it have subject object structure as well?
I would say association does have subject-object structure in the aspect of a relative ego would see particular associations, and other egos might have very different associations. I might like dogs, other people might dislike dogs. On a relative
In
level,
that sense,
associations can be all over the place, and associations vary tremendously. I might initially dislike dogs, and then I come to like them. But I think my thought is that association as a universal structuring is perhaps, maybe this is a difference in the use of the term association now compared to at his time, or I don't know. But to me, association suggests something more concrete. I think in the realm of a phenomenological structuring of the pure self, or a more pure self, that it's more the law, eidetic law, or the structuring has maybe better said as a the possibility and the appearance of association into the relative. So I don't know, Peter or other people. That's an excellent question.
So I have a couple of things. In that section 39, Marvin, where you were talking about the irrational and the fact, and Hedy repeated that issue. He says the particular fact is irrational, by which I think he means that we are not in control of givenness. So if all we were would be sort of rational or transcendental processes of grasping or of synthesizing, we would be in full control. But the particular fact happens as a surprise, or as a happening, as you were just saying, Marvin, as a sort of very complicated system of associational things that you know, sort of, they go where they will kind of thing. I think the particular fact being irrational doesn't mean it's valueless. It just means we are not organizing experience to the extent that everything would then be in our control. Things appear as themselves, as leibhaftig, as having something like a life. And that could only be because finding the proper evidence to the manner in which they appear is a project for us, not a foregiven conclusion. And that leads me to the second thing that you're talking about, Marvin, which is that you know, the evidence is the point. And for Husserl, evidence comes in the way that the thing calls it out of us. So the thing must bear, he says this repeatedly in Ideas and in other places, the thing must bear the stamp of the noetic act that is already on the way to notice it. Like there is this interplay between what we experience and our experiencing acts, and that's where evidence occurs. It does not occur from some sort of adequation of what's in here to what's out there. And that's why he's not doing Brentano, he's not doing Descartes. Descartes, as you said, has this mediation by God. When there's no outside of consciousness, then the procedure for evidence has to happen in the way that they fit together, act and object. And so the thing must be speaking its truth to us, as a way that I could understand what he's saying. We need to go. I am sorry to cut anyone else off. I think, Marvin, you did very well. I appreciate what you said as questions and points as you went through. So for next time, my suggestion is that I not say anything about 39 to 41. First, I think Marvin did fine. Second, I want to get people to the point where they're starting to read the fifth meditation. I want you to all be able to read the fifth meditation on your own after next week, because this will be our last week next week. So I know that Miyuki, you're ready to go with 42 through 44, which are the first sections of the fifth meditation. We do not need to try to go through the whole thing. Maybe in the fall, after we take the survey, right, that we'll send around. Maybe you'll want to continue with the fifth meditation before moving on. Maybe you'll want to move on. Like there's all kinds of things we could do. But does anyone right now know that they would in fact like to present next week on some section after 44?
I
Idea
will
what
do 45.
45. Okay, does anybody else want to do one? All right, I know that Julia earlier had said she'd like to go again. She went before. I have maybe one other student of mine who might like to go. Julia, did you say you wanted to go again? It's okay. She's probably in a zone where it's difficult. Email me if you decide that you would like to present. I think what I would like to do is just say this. Let's read the fifth meditation together. Let's think about the way it will unfold, and you can read my layers in Husserl's Phenomenology, which largely details the fifth meditation, right? So I don't need to talk because it's in the book and you can go read it for yourself. I haven't yet done anything with these first four meditations. But if you look at that book, you'll see my analysis of like 50, 51, 52. Those are the ones where he talks about pairing. And so to your question about whether association is subject and object, it seems pretty clear that pairing is an action that we do with respect to a pair of shoes or a pair of glasses or a pair of people, where we are already giving them together. We're already synthesizing them together. I don't know that we are reflectively doing it, but there is no way that, as Sally mentioned before, empathy could work if we were not already taking us together. And so there has to be some sense of subject and object in order to be doing that associational work. The way the fifth meditation operates, for those of you who haven't read it before, is that Husserl does some crazy sort of scientific experiment in order to push aside all those people who accuse him of being solipsistic. They're like, oh yeah, you're doing transcendental phenomenology, but you're really locked in your own head, dude. So we live out here in the real world with other people, right? And so he's like, okay, let's take you seriously, even though I don't. But he said, let's take you seriously. Let's try to get rid of any reference that we make to other people in our consciousness. And that is where he's going to talk about the reduction to the sphere of ownness. Let's just have it be that the only meanings that we will allow are, our own meanings. And then you're going to find that he has some cool stuff like we have our body and our body makes these kinds of movements and whatever. And then all of a sudden he's going to say, okay, let's lift that crazy restriction and let's look at, as Marvin suggested, let's look at this experience. Let's look at the experience of the other person. And what do we find? We find that they are already within that one thing called transcendental consciousness, which now we have to see as intersubjective. So the important thing to remember is, if it gets hard to read, there's a crazy experiment that he's not really all that committed to. And out of that, he is talking about what he is really committed to, which is that we are already together within transcendental intersubjectivity. The nice thing about the experiment, the reduction to the sphere of ownness, is that in a sense it allows a kind of vision of Genesis, how we understand and can experience each other. And the one story, I don't know, many of you, I don't know how, if you've read the Bible at all, especially in the gospel, but in one of the gospels, there is a woman suffering from a hemorrhage who touches Jesus's fringes of the garment. And when she does that, he feels power leaving himself, right? And so he's like, who touched me? And the disciples of Jesus are like, you're crazy. There's 500 people here. Everybody's touching you. No. There was somebody who touched me. I felt power leave me. He turns around. He confronts her. She feels really bad. Yes, I touched you. Then they reconcile. The point is that feeling of the power leaving, that feeling of being unable to witness, as Jeremy said earlier, the consent, right? He didn't recognize his own consent, and yet there was already this relationship building. Something like that is happening in the language of the fifth meditation when Husserl says, I experience the other person as if I were there, as if a kind of transfer from myself to them. The word transfer is like the flow of power, right? So anyway, and also this is weird parallel of the flow of blood and the flow of power. It's interesting.
Yeah, I know we're almost done, but can I just jump in with a little point? Because one thing that I always found very confusing about the sphere of ownness is I tended in my mind to think that this was a model of the phenomenological reduction, but I think that's not true. The phenomenological reduction is not like excluding the world the way the sphere of ownness talk excludes everything about the world that has to do with others. And in fact, he even says this is all within the phenomenological reduction, and he uses the word abstraction specifically, not really reduction. And that's something I just realized reading this now. I think it might help people when they read it.
Excellent point. And it's also clues us in, I think, Jeremy, to why Merleau-Ponty says there's, you're never finished with reductions in Husserl. In order to grasp the genesis of some sort of sense, you need to keep doing that abstract, you need to keep bracketing all these things so you can witness them emerge on their own terms. So we're never fully done encountering what it would mean for us to have experienced this essence or this thing for the first time, this whatever. So you're right. Absolutely very helpful. Any other thoughts before we go?
I'm kind of confused by the idea of consent in consent for temporality. It seems like the cart is before the horse. The sense of I comes before consent, but temporality comes before the I. So how does that work?
It's a metaphorical, I think, this notion of consent. But what's not metaphorical is responsibility. So I am responsible for temporality, and it is mine. And if it has been constituted, it's by no one else than me, right? If it has generated, if temporality in my life has generated, it comes from no one else but me, right? And so that's going back to Kirill's point. Even ancient philosophy of science or nature is like noticing the organism as a self-regulating, self-defining being. That notion of it powers on its own is implicit in this notion of temporality. And what I mean by consent is that I only become fully aware of my inner temporality and the fact that it happens over and over again by saying, Peter doesn't consent, but Peter isn't the only level at which subjectivity is happening. And so, like, I am perhaps falsely diminishing the layers by saying I consent, right? Because I can never find the consent in myself, right? But I'm also aware that on every level, there is no one else that is generating this temporality, or at least if there is, that has been hidden from me. So we could talk about, Christian mysticism or Jewish mysticism or Islamic mysticism and talk about that point. But at any rate, that's I was playing a little bit fast and loose, but not too fast and loose, right? Because I must be doing something in order to continue to live, right?
The key question is, what is this I? And that refers to the different levels, as you mentioned. So that's helpful.
Hedia.
And yes, I was wondering if the reduction to the peculiar ownness or to the sphere of ownness would be to like delimit what belongs to ego from what does not belong to ego, what is immediately accessible to me as opposed to what is not immediately accessible to me, and I have to find other ways to understand them.
Yes, I think that's
Experience.
certainly, you're right about that. To bolster what you just said, right? What I find is that one hand can turn the other hand into an object, and then it turns back into an organ and can turn this touching active hand into an object and vice versa. So when within the sphere of ownness, I have resources for otherness turning into my own, right? But they're not sufficient resources, as you are talking right now, right? There's not sufficient resources to understand how I could experience this alien other person who is so totally not me. They are not going to be part of my body. They are not, and yet my body somehow transfers itself over there, right? In some sort of subjunctive way that allows for us to understand the empathic intersubjective relationship. And so really it's an attempt, as you just said, to recognize what is in my control, what is in my habit, and what is in my arsenal, as it were, my set of powers to help me recognize the other person while still being insufficient. That is, the other person has to show up, has to do the work to, in other words, to pair with me. And so
And
this
they,
is very similar to the particular fact being irrational. The other person is irrational, right? They are not going to be understandable solely by means of comparison with my relation to myself in time or my bodily self-relation. And yet, my self-relation in temporality and my self-relation as a body prepares me to be not shocked or dismayed or terrified by the other person, right? So I bring all those resources to bear. They're still not enough. That's why they already have to be within consciousness as such. Go ahead, Hedi. I know you wanted to say something.
yeah, thank you. And I think this just prevents us to like presuppose things about the others. And this, kind of increases our responsibility because we cannot say that we know everything about the others. So I think that would be another aspect to this, like thought experiment.
And the same issues of consent that Marvin is raising now will be raised with the other person too, right? I mean, it's like I've consented, and yet clearly I have not consented, right? So both are true at the same time, depending on the layer of which that we're standing on.
Yeah, we seem to always find the words that keep coming up to my mind when we keep talking about consent are receptivity and acceptance a little bit more. It's not something that it's like I give my permission ahead of time and then something can happen. It's more like at once it's okay, this is what's happening, this is what's going on a bit more.
Yeah. I shouldn't be held responsible for the stupid things that my children do, right? And yet I am responsible for the stupid things my children do, right? It's just, and in some sense, they would say, I do those stupid things because you taught me how to do them, right? So there's all that happening with respect to what we're learning about ourselves in terms of the meaning that we, as you said, Carol, accept. We accept, we are receptive to, it's already within us. We have to figure out what to do with that, which is why Sally's point about hermeneutics is so important. Hermeneutics is the taking responsibility for what we are responsible for. That's how I would put it. All right, so Miyuki, we'll plan for you 42 to 44. Hedia will plan for you 45. If somebody else who hasn't presented contacts me, I may have them do 46 or 47. But just plan on coming and talking about the fifth meditation, whatever we find with these sections that are presented on, and just having a more open discussion for our last one. I'm really grateful to all of you who have attended, who are presenting next time, who have already presented. It's been a lot of fun to be with you, and I look forward to next week.
Thank
Christos.
you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Yeah,
See you next
thank you,
week.
thank
All
you.
right, see you
Thank you.
later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sorry, I missed Oh, did he go already? So, okay.